Okay, so for today's session, we have two powerhouses in industry, James and Tony. Tony, thank you for joining the webinar today. We're delighted to have you on board. Would you mind introducing yourself and your company, please?
Hi, Mike, and welcome all. Thanks for inviting me today. A powerhouse in this area. Yeah, you're very complimentary. I think you'll probably gather the colour of my hair and the lack of some of it that I've been doing this sort of thing for quite a while. Predominantly, my work's been in the public sector, predominantly in local government, and like many organisations, trying to work their way through these challenges. I've been working on a number of SharePoint migrations over the last 3 or 4 years. So a little bit of experience here, but I do understand that everyone's situation is different. Looking forward to answering some of your questions today.
Fantastic. Thank you, Tony. And James, lovely to have you on the webinar as well. Would you mind giving us an introduction as well, please?
Sure, thanks, Mike. It's lovely to be here. My name's James Malilio. I'm Principal Consultant at Silversands. And I've been probably doing SharePoint, I'm going to say, for 21, 22 years now. And in that time, probably seen most type of migrations that you could do into SharePoint, from SharePoint, between SharePoint, out of SharePoint. So hopefully I can bring some words of wisdom to this session.
Fantastic. Thank you, James. Thank you, Tony. So for my role today, I'll be the facilitator in the panel discussion. I'll be keeping us to time and keeping the questions coming. So let's get started. Okay, so the first topic is all around getting started. So if an organization is looking to move content to Microsoft 365, it can seem quite a daunting task, quite a big task. So Tony, first question to you, please. Do you have any tips on where we should start?
It's always a challenge, I think, and certainly my experience has been that every organisation is different. But the sort of things that come out in the early discussions I've had is the sort of question about where do I put stuff, and I think it's important in these implementations to sort of get over to the people that you're working with exactly what goes where. So what goes into SharePoint, OneDrive, and Teams, because that seems to be one of the big challenges or big difficulties people have in getting their heads around that. Depends how you've implemented the other tools, but if you're at the starting point, I think having a very clear way and a simple way of explaining that to start with is one of the places to start.
I think that's really, really key. So just having clear expectations and setting that vision, really. So yeah, James, anything to add around the start?
Yeah, I mean, I would spend a little bit of time understanding the content that you're looking to move into Microsoft 365, where it's stored, how it's accessed, who accesses it, and actually, most importantly, who owns it. And I'm going to come back to that later on in the talk. Now, in addition to looking at the content that you want to move into 365, it's important to note that very few organizations are starting with a greenfield 365 environment. They've been using it certainly for the last 2 years, if not longer. And therefore, you're not moving content into an empty house, and that you need to consider what content do we already have in 365? How is it accessed? How is it used? And who owns it? But importantly, what policies and settings have you applied to that content? Because if you're going to move content into 365 and there's already policies applied, the content you move in will then be subject to those policies. So definitely those two things, what you've got and what you're moving into, is a good place to start.
Mike, if I can just add to that, I mean, I think one of the other things that I've experienced about, and it depends where you start the conversation, but clearly having management buying from the top down is quite important to this, because inevitably these programs aren't short. Most of these will take a number of months, and in some cases probably years. But having management buy into that, I think, is important, because there's quite a lot of work to do, and a lot of that work rests with the users rather than the IT department.
I think that's a really good point. I've seen so many of these projects where it's come from IT or without lack of project sponsor, and they don't seem to go anywhere. They can't get kicking the can down the road for a few months. So having the right senior buy-in is certainly important there. So James, anything further to add on that section?
No, I definitely echo having senior stakeholder buy-in, having a sponsor, senior stakeholder sponsorship. This is definitely not an IT-led initiative. As we go through this session, we're going to raise a few points where IT can facilitate, and they certainly bring their subject matter expertise, but this impacts far more than just IT.
Perfect. Yeah, completely agree. Okay, so on to mapping the content into Microsoft 365. So another challenging question that we're often asked by our customers is about where to migrate the content within Microsoft 365. I think there's just so many places. Tony, do you have any advice for anyone struggling with this question?
Yeah, again, I'm sure we're going to say this a few times. It depends where you start from, because many of organisations will have been sort of rushed headlong into the implementation of Teams over the last 2 years.
Yeah,
and that starts creating SharePoint sites and possibly uncontrolled SharePoint sites, because the rush over the last 2 years has been to implement the communication elements of Teams, which has been tremendously successful. And I'm sure we'd all understand, or not understand, how we would do that without. But what we've now got is a situation where a lot of SharePoint sites are sitting in tenants in an unmanaged way. And so trying to work out where you start, I think, is quite a challenging thing. But again, I come back to this simple idea of, well, if you have a story to tell users about, this goes in OneDrive, this goes into Teams, this goes into SharePoint, and a few scenarios, real scenarios to explain, I think that's far easier to get over than an abstract discussion that starts with, well, it doesn't really matter, it's all the same technology, because that doesn't engage the users whatsoever.
I think that's a great point. I mean, you've got to tell the story and put it into their perspective, or I guess help it resonate with them a lot better. It is a lot of change, isn't it? So it's important to get these users on board. James, is there anything you would add to that?
So I think there's two parts to this. There's one part which is organizations definitely have to define an information architecture for their 365 environment. Now, we won't go into details of what an information architecture is here, but essentially it defines where content is put and how it's managed. But the thing that's unique with Microsoft 365 is not so much where content is managed, because any file that's put in Microsoft 365 is stored in SharePoint. That's not the problem. The problem is the fact the user experience. So when users interact with files within Microsoft 365, they are potentially coming from Microsoft Teams, Planner, Yammer, Microsoft Office, Windows Explorer, SharePoint, OneDrive. And the challenge here is to make sure you understand how the user experience is going to work. Now, if we think about moving from a file server to SharePoint Online, when users interact with the file server, they're typically interacting with it through two methods, right? File Explorer, it could be local files, or it could be a shared drive, or they're interacting with it through Microsoft Office on a desktop. Now, if you move those files to 365, that experience is incredibly difficult to replicate. And I'll touch on this later, but simply, it's not a practical assumption to say that users will carry on interacting with those files via File Explorer. When we go into 365, though, the question is, how will those users interact with those files? Now, I've said before, the files are actually in SharePoint, but the users may well interact with those files through Teams, Yammer, etc. And this is a really important consideration when you're thinking about migration. Microsoft are moving towards a Teams-centric world. So essentially what that means isn't that Teams is replacing all the other applications and services, is that Teams is becoming the central focal point where people consume those applications and services. And a great example of this would be Viva Connections. So as an organization, you may well have an intranet that's hosted in SharePoint. Okay, so beautiful intranet, it's in SharePoint. From an end user's point of view, what Viva Connections does is it takes that intranet and it surfaces to you within the Teams experience. Okay, so technically it's still in SharePoint, but from a user's point of view, it's in Teams. And these subtle changes are really important when people say, should we move content to Teams or should we move content to SharePoint? You've got to move the content if it's files to SharePoint, right? That's an easy one to solve. That's not the question though. The question is, how will the user interact with that content? That's the key thing.
I think that's really yeah, I completely agree. I mean, Teams has become such a central part to my workload, and as Microsoft bring more and more things into Teams, it just makes it easier, doesn't it? You don't have to switch between different applications, and certainly from a user experience side, it does make it a lot easier. So as well, people often say, you know, I've heard this phrase a lot. We'll put it into the cloud. We'll put all of this stuff into the cloud. James, is there content that wouldn't be suited for a migration into Microsoft 365?
Yeah, definitely. So if you've currently got a file server, that file server will potentially contain things other than what we would class as documents. So when we refer to a document, we may be saying a PDF file, Word, Excel, PowerPoint, etc., etc. So whilst there's not actually a limit on the size of file that you can put into SharePoint, well, there is a limit, 250 gigabytes, but if you've got files bigger than that, then that's a different matter. So, videos, big files, no problem. Some of the things to consider is that SharePoint is not a great repository to store files that are, transactional files like a database or a log file, right? That's still, if you've got a SQL Server and you need to store the database somewhere, that's still going to have to sit on a file share. And the other thing that catches a lot of organizations out are either files that are of a complex type.
What do you mean by that, James?
So two types of things. One would be something like an AutoCAD drawing. Now, don't get me wrong, you can store AutoCAD drawings in SharePoint, but what's unique about an AutoCAD drawing is a drawing references other drawings. And so when you open it within AutoCAD needs to be able to reference the other drawings. So unless AutoCAD or the whatever application we're talking about here understands how to talk to SharePoint, all of those reference drawings have to exist either on your local device or on a mapped drive. We don't want mapped drives for SharePoint. So the problem is that when you're using applications, specialist applications that require the files to be available either locally or on a network share, that can present a problem and they may not be appropriate to move into SharePoint.
So yeah, I completely agree. So it sounds like there is still a case for some specific examples where on-prem or keeping it within its own application makes sense, and that's purely from a user experience and functionality perspective. There's still a place for on-prem.
I'll just sorry, Tony. I was just going to say that I kind of say it's not so much a case of on-prem. There is still a requirement for provisioning and providing file storage outside of SharePoint Online. Now, that file storage doesn't have to be on-prem. Obviously, that file storage can be in Azure or another cloud services provider. But yeah, so if you're moving from a file server, part of the analysis of what's on that file server may well highlight content that is inappropriate to be stored in SharePoint.
Very
good, thank you. And Tony, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, I just wanted to add a couple of points to that, because I think one of those file types is, as we all know, is macro-enabled Excel spreadsheets, which don't go very well in SharePoint. And my experience has been a lot of the finance departments have these, and so there's an area there that probably will need to come later in any SharePoint migration, or indeed, as James said, always have some sort of shared network drive for files like this. The other point, I think, is more important in that strategically how you're going to store documents in the future. And I'm particularly thinking about images where they're linked to, say, a line of business system, planning system, let's use that as an example. Most of these systems, which are older architectures, store that data in a shared network drive. And clearly migrating that during a SharePoint migration might be a challenge too far. what I've seen most organisations do is adopt that principle that the storage will be not on a shared network drive into their procurement practices, so that the next time a line of business system comes up for renewal, the requirement specification is that it has an independent document storage that can be SharePoint or, as James has said, any other cloud-based or Azure-based or whatever it might be, or even on-prem server-based, but not to rely on the technology that linked it to a good old file server of 15, 20 years ago.
I think that's a really good point, Tony. I think just setting yourself up for future so that you don't catch yourself in this mess again, and make it easier for yourself, and certainly involving procurement and getting it all the way up to them. That means any solution bought for IT or for the business will have that thinking ingrained into it. So no, really good. James, anything further to add on that section at all?
No, I think I'm good. Thank you.
Perfect. Okay, so James and Tony, let's talk governance, security and compliance. So it's a critical foundation for any migration. And when migrating content to Microsoft 365, organizations are often looking to take advantage of all the governance, the security, the compliance capabilities that they get bundled in with the suite, especially if they can go things like E3 or E5. It's rich in those capabilities. But actually having such a broad range of topics and scenarios can again become quite a daunting task. Again, where do you start? Tony, how would you overcome this, and what are the first steps here for governance, security and compliance?
Well, I'm going to leave James to talk about the technical side of this, because without being too distracted, the technical bit is easy once you've got the people sorted out. And in my experience, the key bit here is to get the right people involved. So many organisations will have someone responsible for information governance, and that's great. Many organisations will have data retention policies that they're trying to implement in whatever way they can currently do, whether that's manually or some automated process.
Yeah.
But me, the thing that stood out in the past 3 or 4 years when I've been working with organisations is actually making sure you've got people who've got the authority to make decisions in that process, because it is quite a complex area. It takes a fair bit of thinking through, and it requires the people that are engaged in that conversation, both from the information governance point of view and the technical side of that, to implement those policies. It really requires decision makers, because you're going to have to do some of this stuff and redo it and undo some of it once you realise the implications of those. So it's key to get the right people in the room, and it's key that they are empowered to make decisions, because if you have to wait for a committee or whatever it might be to ratify some of these, you might find that this program extends into years rather than just months.
Yeah, I think that's really key. And I think what a lot of people see, because it's such a daunting task, they actually put off making a decision. But what they don't realise is, by not making a decision, that is a decision in itself. So it's better to have something, a line in the sand, or get the right people to make a decision, and note that can change, and over time.
And I think that's bewildering for people to start with, both for the users but also for the people responsible for information governance. And I know James will cover this point at some stage in the morning, but actually focusing on what the problem you're trying to solve is quite important, because if you just talk about this in the abstract, this huge thing, I've had clients who've got data retention policies that run into volumes and tones. Try and deal with all of that in one go, you're going to be there forever.
I think you're absolutely right. It's a specific business problem. What is it that you're trying to do at the root cause, rather than try and boil the whole ocean and tackle it all at once? And just because you've got a setting doesn't mean you need to play with it as well. James, have you got any views in terms of the governance, security and compliance, and where to start?
Yeah, my kind of mantra on this is you can't go from a standing start to a full sprint in one step. And what I mean by that, and it echoes both of what both of you said, that your licensing enables you to do a huge amount of things, a huge amount of stuff, particularly around governance, protection, security, compliance. And it can be tempting to sort of say, okay, let's sit down, let's understand everything that we've got in this box of Lego, as I call 365. Let's pour it all onto the desk and let's use every single brick to build something. What are we going to build? It doesn't really matter. As long as we use every single brick, then we've succeeded. And I kind of echo precisely what Tony's alluding to and saying here, that the compliance features and the governance features are there to support organizations in meeting their compliance requirements, in supporting their policies, in educating their users. None of it can do anything if you don't have those pieces in place. So really, what we say is understand what policies you do have in place. This could be a written policy on handling sensitive data, or it could be a published retention schedule. Okay, and I get the fact that that published retention schedule may have sat in a ring binder folder on a shelf and not have been opened, or people may be diligently applying it to all of their content on the file servers. Either way, the point is that's a good starting point because that's a written policy you have. Let's understand that as a requirement, and then let's talk through the requirement and understand how the technology can either enforce the requirement, support the requirement, or educate users about the policy. And it really comes to scenarios. So it's a lot of times we talk to people about, right, we want to implement data loss prevention, or we want to implement sensitivity labels. And I get why we're being asked that question. And I love talking about this stuff, so I'm quite happy to engage and talk about the stuff. But actually, what I usually say to them is, look, let's just take a step back. What is it we are trying to solve? And, data loss prevention, well, we want to protect data leakage. Okay, give me some scenarios in your context that resonate with your organization that describe that particular challenge. And then once we've got that, that can be used as a basis to talk about how the technology can support, how technology can support you. So when people move from file servers and even from SharePoint on-premise, their level of information governance and protection and security applied to that content is variable, right? So I'm sure everyone on the call, everything's all perfect. But the reality is a lot of organizations are starting from a situation where retention is a concept as opposed to a reality. Access control policies are best endeavors, and data loss prevention is a case of don't accidentally leave a printed document on a train. The rest of it, the rest of it is non-existent. So it's unrealistic to assume that just by moving directly into Microsoft 365, these things are all going to magically be solved. Yes, you get a lot of capabilities, a lot of bang for your buck in the technology, but the technology does absolutely nothing unless you have policies and guidelines with which the technology can support.
I think that's a really, really good point. There's probably a licensing question in there, but we'll bank that for a bit later on and come back to it if that's okay.
Love a good licensing question.
That's it. So now let's talk content and migration. So everyone we speak to seems to have a different view on what's best, which tools to use, what approach to take. But nearly everyone we speak to has a horror story or has been burnt in a previous role when doing a migration. James, can you walk us through the different migration approaches that any organisation can take with moving content?
Sure. So on the basis that we don't have a week for me to go through all of this, I'm going to use a really simple analogy that I often use, which is when we're moving content into Microsoft 365, it's very much akin to moving house. So our existing content represents our current house. Microsoft 365 represents our new house. Now, the subtle difference between moving house and the reality is you're already kind of living in your new house. You've already been living in your new house for a few years. So you've already got some stuff in there. So it's not like you're moving from house A to house B and none of your stuff's already in house B. So when we look at migrating house A's content, we effectively have two approaches. Approach one is I'm going to sit back, I'm going to pay a removal company to come in, go through every room, box everything up. I'll roughly tell them which room relates to which room in my new house, but I'll let them do it. My job is easy, except for when I actually go to my new house and I realize that that sofa that I said to put in that room doesn't kind of fit properly. That stuff I said to put in the garage doesn't really work in the garage, but all of my stuff's been moved across. Okay. And that's, we call that a lift and shift. It's fine and it works. There's many scenarios where that's exactly what you want. The other approach is a bit more considered approach. So I go through every room in the house. I work out which of my family members is responsible for each piece of content. I make them decide whether to chuck it in a skip or whether to box it up. And if they box it up, they've got to say where it's going to go into the new house within reason. And then once we've done all of that, the removal company comes in, does the moving and the unboxing. The advantage with that approach is A, I've got rid of a load of junk that I didn't need, and B, people have accountability for their own stuff, and therefore their own stuff is placed in the locations in a new house. So both of those approaches, they work in different scenarios. Now, irrespective, sorry, Mike.
No, I was going to say I really like that house analogy, and who wouldn't want to do a bit of a spring clean before they have their nice shiny house? Why do you want to take your content from SharePoint 2007 and cram it into your nice shiny SharePoint Online or Teams site? It doesn't make sense, does it?
Well, it doesn't, but the reality is my lease from my existing house may be running out tomorrow, so I may not have a choice.
That's true.
So, and the other thing I was going to add is when it comes to the actual moving of the content, you have two approaches. So one approach is the removal company comes in on Monday morning, removes everything, puts it in a new house. I shut the door on my old house and I go to my new house, right? Mm-hmm. Clean, everything gets done at the same time. In reality, most migration projects are too large to have that approach. So what happens is we gradually start moving content between house A and house B. This creates a problem because when I wake up in the morning and I think, right, I really need that thing, that book, or I really need that my laptop. Which house is my laptop in at the moment?
Yeah.
And the longer that I'm living in both houses, the more confusing it becomes as to where content kind of exists. So in reality, you've got the choice of the lift and shift or the more considered approach. And you've got the combination of, do I do this in one big bang, or do I do it in a more piecemeal approach? Now, in reality, for large scale migrations for organizations, it's not just a single house move. It's moving a whole street into a new street. And that's to give you an idea of why it becomes essential to plan things out and accept the fact that you won't have one size fits all, and you do need to leave breathing space around what you're doing.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And who wouldn't want to plan it out and make sure it's nice and tidy? But as you say, time constraints may force people to have multiple houses, and I think that's where it can get confusing for the end users, because if you can't find a document, the tendency is let's create a new document, and then you've got duplicate copies. So you can see how the frustration for the end users and how this can have a big impact on the organization, and that will hit the service desk with IT calls if they can't get what they're looking for. Tony, do you have any real world examples of any approaches that you've seen organizations take?
Yeah. I mean, I think the point that James made is very well made. And there's a dilemma here, because I think if you wait until you've got the perfect plan, you'll never implement it. Yep. You've got to start somewhere. And there's some dangers with that, because what you'll find is there will be the early adopters that will start and will just be clamoring to get on with SharePoint, or have used SharePoint in a previous organization or what have you, or just get it, or have found the way to lever their team sites into SharePoint and already using this. And there's a danger with having too many of those people down in the skunk works, basically, before you've agreed your overall strategy. So it's a difficult one to know where to start, but planning to the nth degree, so you've got, you know, the perfect plan before you start, just isn't an option. You have to start, and it will depend where you are as to how you start. For example, one organization that maybe has implemented Teams over the last 2 years, therefore has a legacy of some new SharePoint sites. That might be the starting point with those organizations that are starting using SharePoint to start building up and start building a local expertise around that, which is good, because, you know, if you've got people within the organization that are able to show other parts of the organization the benefits, the business benefits of this, then that's great. But again, be aware that, you know, they can't build too much of their new house when you haven't laid out the street, as to use James' analogy. I think the other thing is making sure that, and it echoes my point earlier about senior management being brought into this, the work needed to move from one street to another is not inconsequential. In some organisations, they may be able to get rid of their rubbish. They may be able to pack up their stuff that they want to keep and move it over quite quickly, or hand it over to the removal company quite quickly.
Yep.
In some cases, it could take months to sort through the millions of files, or the nested folders, or the whatever it is that they've got to actually get it exactly right. So one approach that one organisation has adopted is sort of do this in two ways. Get OneDrive over the sort of line, so that everyone has an experience of what the sharing experience is around SharePoint will give them, so they understand the principles of that, and then start auditing their current network drives to see what can be thrown away. Identify what is needed now. What do I need now to do my job? And that, you know, that could be later migrated or quickly migrated over. But keeping the stuff just in case, which obviously isn't really an option, you know, in your data retention policies. You know, you just can't keep stuff just in case. But of course, the users, if they're told that, will then just move lots more of their stuff over there.
Yeah.
So what we've kept is, you know, a network drive there just in case. Make that read only, perhaps for say 9 months, so that it's there for people to, if they need that file, you know, a project that they thought was dead is now being resurrected, they can drag their network drive files into their new SharePoint sites. And then maybe after a given time, when the organisation is comfortable that it isn't relying on the shared network drives read only, maybe archive those off somewhere where those files are only accessible on request. And that way you've got some backup for users who are sort of worried about making the wrong decisions now, but given the confidence that should they need that file of 2 years ago, as long as their stated retention policy, not the technical retention policy, their actual retention policy doesn't allow them to keep it for more than 2 years, it's there if they need it. And I go back to the point then, because this can be quite a lengthy process, management at a senior level have to understand that this needs to be built into all of the service plans that users are trying to create for the next year, because this stuff won't get done itself, and just lifting and shifting the whole lot really isn't an option.
I think that's a really, really good piece of wisdom there. So keep it bite-sized chunks. Don't do it all in one go. And it's almost those day type compartments. So once you've done it, you can archive it, then move on to the next piece, and just kind of factor that into their day to day. And it is a lot of work, and passing that on to the end users to try and do as much as they can obviously takes the pressure off IT to transition any information.
But also beware that, you know, too much of the early adopter stuff might get in the way when particularly if you haven't addressed the retention stuff at that stage. They'll, you know, the early adopters will just want to move it into an environment that's easier for them, which it is. But you know, the retention and disposal policies need to apply to their stuff as well. And if you do too much of that before you got that bit sorted, you might run into some challenges.
Yeah, I think absolutely right there, Tony. So I think we'll move on to the next section around the impact. So the impact on users and more of the human element of the migration. So James, I mean, typically, what do organisations need to consider regarding the people and the end users, and how they'll be impacted by the migration? Oh, James, you're on mute if you can hear us.
I'm sorry. So I've often used a mantra in the past, which is consider the move to Microsoft 365 as to be life without File Explorer. And how I kind of picture that is, if you imagine your day-to-day working activities, probably pre-lockdown, constituted quite a lot of, I'm looking at File Explorer because I'm navigating to a folder to find a file. Now imagine someone just takes away File Explorer. That's how much of an impact it is. And, you know, people will, you know, many people say to me, but I can lift and shift content from file servers and from SharePoint on-premise. I can put it into SharePoint Online and people can still access it through File Explorer via OneDrive Sync or whatever you want to use. Technically, yes, you can do that. That is not a solution for an organization-wide deployment of SharePoint. And now's not the time to go into why that's the case. But effectively what I'm saying, that users will be impacted. You know, we've alluded before that if you kind of think about moving from SharePoint on-premise or file servers into 365 and you adopt a team-centric approach, guess what? The user's experience is going to be different. If you apply any policies to do with information governance, protection, security, guess what? The user's experience is going to be subtly different. The capabilities provided by 365, you know, Tony alluded to it, sharing, recording meetings, none of that stuff exists in on-premise. So the user experience is going to be different. And, you know, any user that interacts with content, even at the most basic level, needs the ability to find a document, to create a document potentially, to open a document, and to save a document. You've just changed all of those kind of four key things, the basic level of IT skill that someone needs in your move to 365. Now, with the last kind of 2 years, what's happened is we've forced the rollout of Teams, and this has addressed many problems. So in some aspect, what I'm saying isn't going to be entirely new to people, right? They attend Teams meetings, they have Teams chats, they upload files into Teams, you know, so it's not like we're starting from scratch, but you have to take into account the impact to your people. And one thing I'd say is it's not just the impact to people once you've done the migration. If I go back to my house moving analogy, it's what happens during the migration. So how do we minimize the risk that during the migration people understand where content is? And that transitionary piece is very critical part of the project, because actually the user's life at that point is far more difficult. They've got to learn the new tools for the content that they have to access in the new environment.
Yeah.
They have to retain their skills to their existing tools in the current environment, and they have to know when to use what. It's fine once you've moved them to the new environment, they can forget all of that old stuff and move on. But the first thing you're asking them to do is far more difficult than what you're going to be asking them to do in the future. And that's where I think adoption and change management should be a critical part of your planning, because it is simply not possible to do a behind the scenes lift and shift of content. And if actually when organizations say that they want to do it, I'll say, great, take your file servers, move them to Azure storage, and carry on using mapped drives and all that you currently do. Because if all you want to do is to move your content to the cloud to reduce your overhead on storage costs, SharePoint is not the way to go.
Yeah, absolutely agree. I think there's lots of benefits there that can be realised by a proper implementation. And I think planning for that initial change you know, as you said, there's so many things that will impact the end users and how they interact with files and change things. And then it's the iterative, the constant change. As we all know, Microsoft 365 changes for a hobby. So it's not just the one-time round of training, it's planning this in for the end users as a constant change management program. Tony, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I do. I think one of the things that came home to me in doing a few of these is don't assume that users are accessing the content in the way you think they are. And this comes back to the point that James made about this whole new world where people are accessing it through Teams or Planner or whatever it might be. I'll give you an example of that. I think most of the organisations I have worked with would, prior to the pandemic, be pretty much in the camp which they're all desktop based. So predominantly, the first thing they would do in the morning is open their laptop, log on to their network. File Explorer is there. Their whole world is there for them, and it's a familiar world. And during the pandemic, what I found with some organisations is, strangely enough, users found different ways of doing that. So a number of organisations or a number of people in organisations started at office.com in the morning rather than on their laptop. Now that all depends upon your policies around bring your own, etc., etc. And then another group of people, and I'm sure people on this call had this, were started using their mobile phones for Teams because they didn't have a device that would work that way. So you have got a group of people that are perhaps accessing the same data in many different ways. And I think my mistake in some of the early work I did was assuming people were based around a PC and starting their day from a desktop, the Windows desktop. That isn't the way it's going to be in the future. Teams, as James said, is going to be one of the preferred ways into pretty much everything from Microsoft. But I suppose from my point of view, is make sure you don't make the assumption that everyone's doing it the way you expect them to, because their solutions work perfectly for them. And I know some users who now go nowhere near the corporate network because all of the stuff they need to work with is in SharePoint. So just don't make the assumption everyone's doing it the way you think they're doing it.
I think that's a really good point. And it isn't really until you start doing these big programs that you realize just how many ways there are to do the same kind of task. So I think that's a really valid, engaging the users, finding out how they're using it in their specific scenario, and making sure that you can cater for different departments and different ways of using those files.
Yeah, no, just one further thing on that, Mike, and I think this is one thing that that's come across in the work I've done is some people are inherently suspicious or concerned about the fact they don't know where their content is. If you use James's analogy, which says, take away File Explorer and I'm a little bit blind, but actually I open Word and there's my documents that I was working on yesterday, or this, that, and the other. There are people who are inherently suspicious of the fact they don't know where their data is. And I think, again, going back to my first comments in this, is having a simple way of explaining that to people of where you expect them to keep the data starts making that discomfort a little less uncomfortable, because otherwise you just get people opening Word and carrying on working on the document that they worked on, not knowing where it is, not knowing who they shared it with. And that may not be what you want to do in terms of your document retention or security policies.
I think that's really valid. Thank you, Tony. I think we're now at the point in which I'd like to open it up to audience questions. So we have about 10 minutes for this section. If you'd like to pop any questions in the chat, or please raise your virtual hands, we can unmute you and you can ask any questions. So does anyone have any questions about any migrations that they're looking to do? Okay, yeah, Guy, just unmute.
You talked very well about the different movement of data from existing to new environment and mapping it out, how dangerous is it to reorganize that data on its journey? I.e., I've got two different departments doing the same work. Currently, they've got separate file shares. I'd like to put all of that into a single SharePoint area because actually they're doing the same thing. Does that make sense, the question?
Yeah, and I think it's not so much a case of it being dangerous. The inherent risk is obviously that the people that need to use and consume that content won't understand your new structure. So technically, absolutely, if it makes sense to restructure it and reorganize it, it makes sense to do it as part of the migration or prior to the migration, depending on what type of content it is and where it comes from. Key thing for that is adoption and change management. So technically, definitely makes sense, but that needs to be accompanied by the appropriate comms, guidance and education provided to the people that need to use it. Because otherwise, one of the problems is no organization is a static thing, right? And file shares and SharePoint on-premise and even SharePoint Online architectures are designed with an organization in mind at that point in time. Organizations change, so there is a need to restructure content, and the content will make more sense to someone, if you like, joining the organization today than it would do with someone who's got that inherent history of, oh, well, we've always done it that way, that's where the content should be. But I'm a great believer that you want to avoid these legacy cul-de-sacs of content that are really difficult to assign ownership to because they represent a part of the organization that doesn't exist anymore. So no new part of the organization wants to take responsibility for it. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, it's I think yes, to me it's always seemed like a giving them the guidance and the understanding of the value of the act, rather than just saying, oh, there's your files again, this is why we've done this to it, or we want to do this to it. Though again, that change would always, in my mind, be driven by the business units involved.
Yes.
rather than just a logical, that's the same.
Sorry. I just add to that it's not a touch it once and let them get on with it. I'm often asked, come on, Tony, what does best practice say our organisation of data should look like? And that's almost impossible to answer because it has to be business centric, but actually giving them some guidance at that stage about what's possible and then letting them work out how they want to organise it is one thing. But my experience has taught me if you then disengage from those users, they'll start getting themselves in some difficulties that once you then get to the migration part, may present technical problems. I think what I've seen is a re-engagement with those users once they've gone away and know the basic rules and then worked out how their data should be organised, to re-engage with them prior to any migration that you might do on their behalf or may get them to do. You actually got to know how they want it to work after you've given them the basic rules. Otherwise, they'll create structures that just don't work and may be difficult technically to move across.
That's a really good point there, Tony. Thank you, Guy. I hope that answers your question there. Alan, you've got your hand up. Would you like to unmute and ask your question as well?
Yes, if you possibly remember, we had a migration from, at the time, SharePoint 2010 to Online a couple of years ago with yourself. Yeah. And, that was one example of the lift and shift that you alluded to, James. We're now in a slightly different situation where we're looking at migrating, there's possibly in the region of 33 million files from a variety of disparate file shares into the SharePoint environment, it's understood that there's going to have to be some very careful planning by the individual departments or even teams within those departments to work out what they actually require at the end of it. The one sticking point I've actually identified, because we're actually still using the ShareGate migration tool that was identified at the time to be ideal for our situation. The one thing that actually links in with something that James mentioned, which was you were mentioning about AutoCAD with referencing to other drawings. The two things that I'm actually sort of mentally wrestling with at the moment. Well, I know the fact that if you move documents with links, and I'm just talking about Microsoft documents, from file share to SharePoint, where they've got links to other documents, and they can be documents in the same area. You can move the documents en bulk. The problem remains the fact that they retain the links because they are absolute rather than relative.
Correct.
And in terms of what we actually used and are still using at the moment, it comes into the realm of having identified that, you then have to go looking for another third party that may be able to handle the transfer of the documents and the sorting of the links without manual intervention. And the other side on that is obviously where you've got Excel with cells and worksheets that reference other files.
I mean, so just a couple of points. I just want to make it clear that AutoCAD drawings can be stored in SharePoint. I don't want to give anyone the wrong impression there. But in answer to your question, basically, we're talking about documents that reference other documents, be it on file servers or be it anywhere else. Excel being a good example. It's a problem, and it's not only a problem for moving them into SharePoint and having them working. It's a problem for them being in SharePoint and creating new links. I don't want to get into the technicalities, but there is some tooling available that will analyze content that you're moving into SharePoint, or sorry, a set of files on a file server or SharePoint, and it will tell you which ones contain links, and they will provide some mechanisms to update that links. I wish I could say that is a really simple problem to solve in its entirety, but I'm not going to say that because that would lead you down the wrong path. The fact that you've recognized it's a challenge, you're absolutely bang on. It will be a challenge, and it's something that you, as part of the migration, you've got to look at mitigating the risk of actually what happens is you migrate loads of files. The users go and start using the files. All of our files are broken. We can't use any of this, so we're going to carry on using our files back on the file server. So you the migration's failed essentially. So definitely, my recommendation would be to do a risk assessment, impact assessment of the proportion of files that are going to be at risk of not working when you migrate them. Look at the type of files, and therefore look at, for each type of file, each type of scenario, what the potential resolution is to it. So if it's Excel, or if it's AutoCAD, or if it's other sort of things, do any of these tools help? Do they not help? So basically, go into it with your eyes open. Unfortunately, it does require a bit more analysis up front, but otherwise you run the risk of migrating loads of stuff that's just not going to work.
Alan, we've actually had some analysis done by some of the teams already, and I'm actually collating some of that at the moment. So I think I just thought it was something that other people on this call might want to additionally take into consideration.
That's a good point, Alan.
So really good point. John Walker's also posted a message in the chat. I think we'll just move on to the final advice, and we may have to come back to you offline, John, and certainly Alan as well, if you want to pick up that discussion. But I always like to end these sessions with a final note. So, Tony, if you had one piece of advice for anyone looking to migrate content into 365, what would that be?
I think the one piece of advice is start. Don't plan to get exactly right, but make a start, because until you do that, you won't start to understand some of the complexities. And if you, as I say, it's not a program that you can have all the answers to on day one. You just got to start somewhere, and people have to realise this is going to be a lengthy program, and in some cases, Alan's data, for example, might take years to migrate, or not, as the case may be, or change the processes. But without a start, you'll just be sitting here scratching your head, watching all the changes that Microsoft make to the product, and be nowhere nearer what you're really trying to achieve, which is some sort of automation on document retention and your information governance policies.
Brilliant, thank you, Tony. And James, any final words of wisdom to share?
Yeah, so it's a bit of a cliche, but you really need to think of Microsoft 365 as a journey, not as a destination, and therefore migrating content into it, yes, is a step in that journey. Unfortunately, I'd love to say that once you've done that, you'll never do a SharePoint migration again. But as I said, organization structures change, and therefore I'm starting to speak to some clients who've defined an information architecture for SharePoint a few years ago, SharePoint Online, I should say, and they're now having to re-architect some of that. So great time to be a consultant.
Absolutely. Certainly Microsoft changes do keep us in business. So yeah, thank you, James, and thank you, Tony. So I wanted to close by saying, yeah, thanks to James, thanks to Tony, and thanks to everyone for attending today. If you have found today useful and you're asking yourself, well, where do you go from here? We do have a 5-day SharePoint migration accelerator to build on today's discussion. It will discuss approaches specific to your environment and your challenges, and the output will be kind of a high-level plan with a set of direction as well. I'll make sure I send out the recording for this session alongside this accelerator. But thank you again, and we look forward to seeing you all very soon on the next seminar and webinar. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.